Thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion of budget and contract negotiation tips. My name is Liz Christensen, and I am a client engagement manager at PFS Clinical, and I'm here with my colleague, Colin Gruner, who is a senior contracts and compliance analyst. At PFS Clinical, we work to find administrative solutions for complex research problems, and we help our clients optimize efficiencies. So today, Colin and I are going to help you set the stage for efficient negotiations. I'm going to talk to you about ways in which we can budget smarter and not budget more. And then Colin is going to talk to you about using contracts as a budgeting resource. We're going to speak for about 45 minutes and leave a chunk of time at the end of the hour to take questions from the audience. So as you're listening, please feel free to submit any questions you may have through the online portal. So as I mentioned, the theme for today is to budget smarter and not more. We want to increase profit by increasing efficiency and not by increasing our prices. So how do we do that? Well, some sponsors will actually offer extra monetary incentive for starting the study at your site quickly. So this fee is never something we would actually budget for or have a cost associated with in our internal budgeting assessments. It's simply a nice incentive for hard work and strategic thinking. Sometimes you'll see it called early activation or perhaps a rapid document turnaround fee. If you see this offered in your budget, be prepared to work quickly and efficiently. Also, the quicker we get the study started, the quicker we can enroll patients. A higher enrollment leads to more revenue. Finally, the less time that we spend during negotiations and study startup efforts means the less institutional resources we've used up. So really, time is money. So what are some ways in which we can increase efficiency and get these studies started more quickly? Well, one strategy is to utilize clean communications. The first step to clean communication involves having foresight and communicating or sharing that foresight with the person you're negotiating with. If you're negotiating on behalf of your site, there is no way for the sponsor or CRO to know what your institution's goals or deadlines are unless you share that information with them. From experience, I've learned that being cognizant and transparent about IRB deadlines as well as signatory availability will prevent unnecessary delays in your study startup process. So to set the pace for the negotiations, I like to include the deadline and goal dates in each email communication. I'll typically list this in the subject line so it's bold and eye-catching. At the start of the negotiation, I'd also recommend checking in to see if the person who is going to sign that document has any planned out of offices that might affect your goal dates. Now, the second step to clean communication is presenting and documenting all communication within the same platform throughout each round. And now by platform, I mean email, phone, track changes in the CTA or the Word document, or track changes in the budget Excel grid, whatever format you plan to be working on. Now, I don't want to say pick one way and stick with it because that's just really inflexible and infeasible. So instead, I'll say pick one way and stay true to it. So pick your hub format. The goal here is to create a chronicle or a map of the communication. So the negotiation, if and when that changes hands or is delayed for some time, it would be easy for someone else to start where you left off and avoid backtracking. It's also absolutely important to have phone calls to talk through and negotiate tough items at certain times in the negotiation. Now that said, following the phone call, a follow-up communication with an update to your hub format document is an absolute must. This strategy also makes escalations for approvals easier because the person who this is being escalated to will actually be able to understand the full story of the negotiation timeline as they review that chronological listing of comments and decisions. Now, another strategy for efficiency is understanding the needs and constraints of the party that you're negotiating against. When redlining the sponsor's budget to incorporate your fees and prices, really be cognizant of the fact that this sponsor budget format needs to be streamlined to a certain extent with all the other sites on this study. So you may have a very specific way of budgeting internally, but the more you alter the sponsor's format, the more pushback and review you're going to encounter. The internal budget that your site builds can be the source of truth that incorporates all of the details that you need. The sponsor budget doesn't need to hold every single detail that your internal budget does. Next, let's be sure that we have a process in place preemptively to address any impasses so we don't get stuck there when that time inevitably comes. Sites who are smart and serious about budgeting have policies in place that define who can approve the study moving forward when a budget is below the acceptable ranges. Now, I also find that it's helpful for negotiators to have a thorough list of deal breaker items so that they know, well, we will always walk away if and when this item is not included or is not up to par. So give your negotiators the tools that they need to make those quick decisions on their own and to know when they need to send that for next level approval steps. Okay, so now we're getting ready to send that first email. What are some things to consider before actually hitting send? First, if it's applicable, let's reference the last budget negotiated with the same sponsor or the same CRO. Here we'll look to see what was approved or not approved, and we'll look at dollar ranges as well as perhaps tailoring the budget accordingly. Now, I caution you to take this tip with a grain of salt. Just because something was approved on a previous study doesn't mean that it should hold true for this study as well. I'm just simply making the recommendation that our negotiators should be aware. Next, I'll always recommend that you send letterhead documentation with the first round of negotiations. This is a super easy way to cut timelines and questions from your CRO or your sponsor. Negotiation trends are showing that more sponsors and CROs are requiring documentation for administrative fees especially, so we may as well send the documentation right away instead of waiting for that request to come through. Also, documentation may actually allow the CRO to approve certain fees without escalating it to the sponsor. So really, by sending this up front, you're likely to save at least a few days of negotiation time, if not more. Okay, so that first email has gone out the door. Now we're knee deep in the negotiation. So how do we push that communication process along? I'm coming back to that clean communication theme again. Please, please, please do not provide new comments to your negotiation partner in a document with the same name as the one that was previously sent to you. This creates a huge opportunity for error and miscommunication. Version control is absolutely key. So take the extra 30 seconds to rename the document with either your initials or some kind of standard institution identifier and the date. You'll thank yourself later, and your negotiator will also thank you. Now, I mentioned previously that I'm a huge fan of picking up the phone to work through negotiations. I especially think you should pick up the phone if your initial edits to the sponsor budget are drastically different from what the sponsor has offered. Oftentimes, this means that there's actually a misunderstanding about the protocol requirements. So to give you an example, I recently had a site who was interested in participating in a study that was going to follow patients for 10 years. So naturally, they budgeted for time and effort associated with tracking patient data for 10 years. The budget they were going to propose was many multipliers away from what the sponsor had offered them. Now that's when I advised that we pick up the phone and have a discussion. And during that conversation, it came to light that the site would really only be responsible for collecting and reviewing the data from the initial visit. And then from then on, an outside vendor would be collecting and reviewing the data for the sponsor, and the site would actually be able to close out the study altogether. So hence the very large difference in budgets. Now, I also recommend picking up the phone once you get beyond about 3 back and forth rounds of email communications. At this point, you're probably at an impasse with some items, and working through things verbally can help the sponsor or CRO to better understand why certain items might be important to you and may better allow you to discuss some alternative options for a compromise. Now, lastly, I'll say pick up the phone if you haven't heard from someone in over a week, unless you know the rationale for that. This is especially applicable after sending the first email. Sometimes your contact has left the institution or is on some kind of extended leave and you weren't made aware of that. Or perhaps this person is actually patiently awaiting your email and has been checking their inboxes frequently, but it's inadvertently ended up in their junk mailbox. So picking up the phone is really the best way to avoid extended lags due to those types of issues. So what do we do when negotiations stall? How do we jumpstart the process again? This slide is a list of some questions that I like to ponder and potentially bring to the table with the sponsor. First, are you declining due to a lack of funds, or is it because of sponsor policy and legal aspects? If it's the former, maybe we need to reconsider participating in the study. And if it's the latter, maybe we just need to ask for the fee in a different way. Another question to ask is, can we allocate this fee elsewhere? We can also ask, can you approve this fee with further documentation, or is this just an outright no? We can also ask what the max on an individual item is, or what the max on the total budget is. And perhaps we can pull out the item into an invoiceable rather than having it in the per patient budget, and this will actually allow us to get it approved. These are all good things to think about when you're at an impasse. Now that we've talked about budgets and how to set the stage for efficient negotiations, I want to talk about the importance of payment terms and how addressing these appropriately can ensure that your site maximizes their financial benefit. When it comes to payment terms, simple is best. Make the payment terms user-friendly so no one has to email back and forth and figure out what they actually mean. When reviewing the contract and budget exhibits, you're always going to want to ask yourself, is it defined here when we'll be paid? If it's unclear to you now, it isn't going to be clear to you or the responsible party months or years from now when the study is actually active. So don't be afraid to insert language that makes sense to you. Keep in mind these terms should be reasonable for the sponsor too. Demanding that the sponsor have extra requirements is only going to add delays to the contracting process. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to give examples of some pretty terrible payment terms and 3 tips on how to fix them. My first tip is to ask yourself, what are the payment timelines and triggers in this contract? It really must be clear when the sponsor owes your site a payment, so pay attention to the fine print. Potential payment triggers could be at a visit completion or once data is entered into the CRF, or perhaps it's once the data is monitored. It could also be once an item is invoiced or at a certain patient or study milestone. Whatever the trigger may be, it's important that it's clearly defined in the contract. Keep in mind that when payment is tied to an activity, that activity should be easy to track on both the site and the sponsor side. So the site must be able to track it and the sponsor must be able to verify it. Now, accounting is typically done on a monthly basis, and payments at frequencies greater than monthly will impact your accounts receivable and cash flow. So ideally, we want to see monthly payments, but if that's just not possible, then let's shoot for every 45 days from whatever that defined payment trigger is. But make sure when you read the contract language that you're not asking yourself, paid within 30 days of what? So insert that clarifying language when you need to. Lastly, you'll want to make sure that the timeline is not dependent on activity that's outside of your site's control. We really should try to avoid language like within a certain number of days following sponsor review. If it read something like that, your site has no control over when that review process happens, so you really have no control over when you're getting paid. That's kind of a big no-no here. Here's an example of some bad payment language. Payment for subjects is contingent upon compliance with this agreement and the protocol, completion and submission of case report forms, timely data query resolution. What does timely mean? There's a lot left up to interpretation with that line. Now, this payment is also dependent on the reasonable discretion of the sponsor. Again, what does that mean? This could be interpreted by people in a number of different ways. This also never mentions how frequently the site is getting paid. So put your best business pants on here. You want the sponsor to be contractually obligated to pay you at a certain frequency. Here's another example. At first, this one looks like it might be okay. Payment timing is defined as quarterly, right? But as many of us in the industry know, it's actually usually within 30 or 45 days of the end of the quarter. So if the end of the quarter comes, the payment team doesn't actually know how long it will take to get paid. Data monitored is a payment condition to look out for, and it can be a real trap. You might negotiate to be paid every 30 days, but the term also says, and data monitored. This could actually mean your payments aren't going to be monthly. If payment does have to depend on data being monitored, you'll want to confirm that monitoring schedule with the sponsor and make your accounting team privy of when that is. Reconciliations. These are resolved within the next quarterly payment. This means that your books will be off for at least a few more months. Almost every study and study payment for that study will have some type of reconciliation required with the sponsor. My next tip is to look out for holdback conditions. Holdback causes a significant loss of working capital, and holdback is really the money that the sponsor gets to keep in their pocket and have available for investments for their company's benefit when it should be your site that is using the money for internal growth and investments. So don't accept more than 10% holdback. You shouldn't have to. Here's an example of what I mean by loss of working capital. We have an oncology study in which patients are being seen for up to 15 years. The total per patient budget for all 15 years is about $177,000. We also expect to enroll 9 patients. Now, by reducing holdback from 20% to 5%, we recoup over $200,000 that can be used to support our internal operations and maintenance, and it can serve as allowed capital for investments. Now, maybe your site doesn't do oncology studies, so you're saying to yourself, well, that last tip just isn't applicable for us. Here's an example of an Alzheimer's disease study in which patients are being seen for up to only 4 years. The total per patient budget for all 4 years is about $106,000. We also expect to enroll 7 patients. Here again, by reducing holdback from 20% to 5%, we still recoup over $110,000 in working capital. My last tip is really just an extension of tip number 1, but is one that I see missed frequently. Complex studies have several invoiceable items along with most of the administrative fees. So while there may be a list of invoiceables, they often lack a payment timeline. So make sure to specify the number of days after receipt of invoice in which you will be paid. Typically, this should be around 30 days. You'll want this information in order to reconcile within the fiscal year for financial reporting purposes. Also, invoiceables tend to be expensive, so you could really skew some of the reporting if these are not paid in a timely manner. Also, we'll check for deadlines to submit the invoices. Sometimes these can get tight, especially at large institutions where information has to be passed from island to island through approvals and reviews. So make sure that you're checking those definitions within your payment terms as well. Here's a sneaky way to get more frequent payments. It actually tends to be easier to negotiate a 30 or 60-day payment timeline for invoiceables than it is for visit milestones. So if a sponsor won't do monthly visit payments, move those pricier items to the invoiceable section in order to get paid more quickly. Okay, here's an example of some poor language. The budget does address invoiceables, but doesn't say when to expect the invoice to be paid. Just like following up on negotiations is required, it's also required for payments. Now this one looks a bit better at first glance, but it only defines when to submit the invoices, not when they will be paid. Remember, don't be afraid to insert that clarifying language. That's all the budgeting information that I have for you, and I hope those tips allow you to improve your financial performance, not by budgeting more, but by budgeting smarter. Now I'm going to pass it over to Colin, and he'll talk to you about streamlining contract negotiations, and he'll offer tips on how to get your site the best protections.
All right, thank you, Liz, for that great insight, and hello, everyone. So Liz addressed how to budget smarter through efficient budget negotiations and clear budget and payment terms language. And now I'm here to talk a little bit about the contract and how it relates to the budget and the sponsor's payment obligations in general. So with that, let's jump right on in. So when negotiating your budget and contract with a sponsor, it's important to remember that the budget and payment terms there at the end of your contract is not the only spot in your agreement with the sponsor that addresses the sponsor's payment obligations. In order to get a full understanding of the sponsor's obligations as well as your own costs and obligations, you want to review the contract carefully in conjunction with the budget to hopefully try and create some consistency across all the payment language and eliminate any potential confusion. Because quite often you will find that there's a good amount of inconsistency between the budget and the contract template. So today we'll discuss some ways to find and eliminate some of those potential inconsistencies. Note here at the bottom the benefits of carefully reviewing the contract language. Like I mentioned earlier, reviewing the contract is going to help you really grasp what all you will or may be required to do as a site under the clinical trial agreement. And it will help you make sure any potential obligations you have are being properly compensated by the sponsor. If you're just reviewing the protocol and the schedule of events, you're not getting a full understanding of your obligations for each and every study. There's a good chance that you're leaving yourself exposed to some potential costs or payment disputes down the line. You really need to look through the contract carefully and effectively to adjust the language in the template to make sure all of your obligations as a site are being accounted for. And note here another benefit of careful contract review is that you may find the sponsor is already agreeing to pay for some of those items and procedures in the contract template. This can be beneficial if you are having issues including line items for certain costs in the budget itself. So if you can spot this language, it will go a long way in budget negotiations. Lastly, carefully reviewing the contract allows you to create consistency and clarity around the sponsor's payment obligations to hopefully avoid any payment disputes and avoid any more work down the line. So what we'll do today is learn how to, first of all, identify language that brings sponsor payment obligations into play. Second, we'll talk about ways to beef up that language to ensure you're getting paid and ensure the language is consistent with the budget. And third, we'll talk about how you can use the contract template to make sure every potential cost you could incur during the conduct of the study is covered. So let's talk about how we identify the language that brings sponsor payment obligations into play. As Liz described in depth earlier, the payments are primarily discussed in the budget and payment terms. But you will frequently find that payments are also addressed in various other locations throughout the clinical trial agreement, including a specific section dedicated to the compensation being paid for under the agreement. As you comb through the clinical trial agreement, it's important to recognize where the sponsor is already agreeing to pay for certain study-related tasks and procedures, and where the sponsor should be paying. A few slides down the line, I will walk you through some provisions that typically contain these hidden obligations and payments. But first, note here we have 4 categories or locations in your clinical trial agreement where payments are going to typically be addressed. First, you have the budget and payment terms, but you also have a specific contract section that should broadly address the payments being made for in the study. And you should also have a number of individual contract sections that each contain some type of payment language. So let's talk about this payments or compensation section that I mentioned in the last slide. This section is included in most clinical trial agreements. It's going to be in most every template you come across. And this section will typically be unique from the actual budget and payment terms. This section will be contained within the actual contract itself and hopefully address more broad compliance topics rather than getting into the weeds on any real payment specifics or dollar amounts. It's important to review this section carefully as there's sometimes some overlap between what the budget and payment terms are already addressing. And I'll touch on some of those potential overlap items in a minute, but like I said, this section should really just include broad language that addresses the party's compliance with the relevant physician compensation laws. We'll typically touch on fair market value representations, and hopefully it should reference the budget and payment terms attached as an exhibit to the agreement. There are some other provisions that you might find in there regarding payment obligations upon termination or payment for attendance at investigators' meetings, but typically anything that gets more detailed and specific than that should be a red flag and point you towards the budget and payment terms. So what are some of those red flags to watch out for? I typically look out for anything that has a dollar amount associated with it. If there's something in this compensation section specifying certain dollar amounts, there's a good chance that is also included in the budget or should be included in the budget, and you'll want to reference the budget for consistency. Another red flag would be screen failure terms. Again, this is something that will typically be addressed in the actual budget and payment terms with a specific dollar amount, frequency, and potentially a cap or a maximum. For whatever reason, sponsors will sometimes slide references to screen failure criteria in this section. So you'll want to make sure you check the budget and payment terms for consistency. Some other items that might be a little bit more obvious, but do find their way into contracts are specific administrative fees, like the ones listed here. Two would be terms specifying a maximum amount to be paid for the study. You'll sometimes see this language that says the maximum amount to be paid for under this agreement shall not exceed a total of X, which is problematic for some reasons that we'll address in a few minutes. And you might also find specific payment timelines for when invoices should be sent or when sponsors should complete payments for services performed. One more thing you'll want to look out for here is any language that might give the sponsor the right to cancel or recoup all payments in the event of a breach or deviation from the protocol by the institution. Sponsors will often try and slide language in that protects them in the event of termination, but you want to ensure that nothing in the contract forces you to relinquish those dollars you've already properly incurred up to the point of termination. That's another big red flag. So anything you see here on this slide is something you're typically going to want to strike in negotiations, or at the very least reference the budget and ensure any dollar amounts or payment timelines are consistent with the budget. But a good rule of thumb when you come across anything on this slide is to just go ahead and strike and try to address it in the budget. The sponsor may question your revisions here, but in your communications with the sponsor, it's important to discuss with them the importance of consistency between the budget and contract. The sponsor will often have multiple people reviewing the relevant portions of the budget and contract. So to ensure consistency across all aspects of your agreement, it's important to make sure that we aren't including anything in this section that contradicts what the budget is already saying. Budget negotiations go multiple rounds with dollar amounts and payment timelines changing significantly each time. It's better to address specific payment amounts and timelines in the budget and payment terms, so there is one clear message about how much and when payments will be made. This will help you avoid any inconsistency and hopefully avoid any payment disputes later down the line. So we just addressed that specific payment or compensation section that kind of broadly discusses the payments being made for your participation in the study. But where are all of these other hidden payment obligations that I mentioned earlier on? As you can see here, I've pulled out a number of the common provisions in a clinical trial agreement where you'll either find additional site obligations that should signal a need for sponsor payment, or language that maybe already contains a sponsored promise of payment. Note that these topics vary in subject matter, and also note that they are usually not lumped together in the same one or two sections of the contract. They will be spread out across 20 to 30 page templates, again emphasizing the need for and importance of detailed contract review in conjunction with the budget. I have 6 different types of sections where you might typically find these hidden payment obligations. So the first thing I'm going to do is break this group of 6 in half and start with the top 3. We'll discuss these first 3 topics separately because these are usually expenses that a sponsor either already has or typically will agree to pay for in the budget for a study. Tasks like shipping and handling of study records, drugs, study equipment, biological materials, these are all fairly common and most likely required for almost every clinical trial. Therefore, the sponsor expects the site to incur these costs and is usually willing to compensate the site accordingly. hopefully with little or no pushback. If these items are not addressed by a specific line item in your clinical trial budget, this language is usually a good indicator that you should be including these costs in your budget. And like I said, hopefully the sponsor doesn't really fight you on these. Let's start out by identifying some of the language cues associated with these hidden obligations. One of the most common site obligations that will be addressed in a clinical trial agreement is the need for the site to ship or destroy pertinent study information and materials. Sometimes all shipping and destruction language will be handled in one section, but more often than not, you'll find this language scattered throughout multiple sections of the contract. For example, the confidential information section will touch on return and destruction of the sponsor's confidential information provided to or generated by the site through the study. Additionally, you may see record retention sections addressing the return of study-related records after the requisite retention period specified by the agreement. Or you will find specific language in the termination section or a section devoted entirely to the supply and handling of the study drug or biological materials. Look here at an example of some common language that should be a cue to the site reviewer that indicates a site obligation and a need for a corresponding sponsor payment. My experience, if you were to say have 100 sponsored budget templates, only a good handful of those would have a specific line item already included for various shipping and destruction costs. So I find this language is a good reminder that you should be getting paid for all the shipping costs associated with conducting a clinical trial. Note the burden to the site here. The sponsor is requiring the site to either ship or destroy pretty much anything pertaining to the study at the sponsor's option after the completion of the study. We'll come back to this language in a second. Here we have some language that you might find in the specific record retention section or maybe a study data section. All sites will be required by law to store records and data for a certain period of time. And sponsors expect the site to incur some cost for that maintenance and storage of these records usually. Therefore, they will typically agree to some compensation in the budget for record storage and maintenance. You want to make sure that you add a line item for your costs here in the budget and adjust the language accordingly in the contract. We will also revisit this language in a minute. And finally, we have some language outlining the sponsor's right to monitor the study. You'll sometimes struggle to get sponsors to pay for regulatory inspections, but anytime the sponsor is coming on site to monitor the progress of the study or to audit study records, they will typically agree to pay for that time and effort associated with assisting the sponsor, their representatives during those visits. So we want to update the budget and contract accordingly, and we'll touch on this in a minute. Alrighty, now we've seen some examples of language that should clue you into the need for some type of sponsor payment. And here's a helpful little chart that outlines the steps you can take and some rationale you can use to hopefully help ensure you're getting paid for everything you need and help ensure that the budget and contract are clear and consistent on what is being paid for by the sponsor. Note the first step here is to always reference the budget and payment terms either prior to or during your review of the clinical trial agreement. It might also help to have it open as you run through the contract. So this far left side of the chart is probably more applicable if you are reviewing the contract well into budget negotiations. And it addresses a situation where you review the contract language and find that certain costs already being covered in the budget don't seem to be lining up with the contract language. If you find that this is the case, you'll want to add some clarifying language to the contract to make sure that it's clear that the specific site obligation is going to trigger a corresponding sponsor payment obligation in accordance with the budget. This middle row here says, if the cost is covered in the contract language but not covered in the budget. This is probably more consistent with what you'll see earlier on in the budget negotiation process, where you come across some language in the contract that says, for example, the institution shall do X, Y, and Z at sponsor's expense. Now, this is one of those hidden sponsor payment obligations I referenced earlier that can be beneficial in budget negotiations. Let's say you see this in a contract. You actually now have a leg to stand on in budget negotiations if there's no corresponding line item in the budget. If X, Y, and Z in this case has to deal with study record return costs, you can take that back to the budget and throw in a cost for document shipping. Note here on the bottom, if the sponsor pushes back, just ask them to look back at the corresponding contract section or page number and ask why it's being paid for there, but not in the budget. And that's usually the end of the conversation. The sponsor is going to agree to that fee more times than not. It's pretty difficult for them to argue that they can't agree to a fee when their contract template explicitly says that they'll be paying for that cost. This can also be helpful later on in budget negotiations if you have an internal budget bottom line to meet and the sponsor isn't offering to pay for anything else. So you may want to go back to the contract. Even if you don't want to read over the whole contract again after it's already been mostly negotiated, go ahead and plug in the words expense or cost in the document search bar. Doing this may lead you to certain provisions of the contract where the sponsor may have already agreed to compensate you for certain costs. You can then take those provisions back to the sponsor and more effectively push for a few more fees to get added to the budget, hopefully, and meet that bottom line. Then lastly, here on the right, you'll see the third scenario where neither the budget nor contract templates include the necessary cost. So you'll just want to make sure that you have all of your obligations under the protocol and contract properly accounted for and addressed in both the budget and contract. So here's the same example we saw earlier, only now we have some language added to clarify that the sponsor is going to be paying for the shipping and destruction of study materials. I really like this language here because, one, it clarifies that all shipping and destruction costs for any and all study-related materials are being covered by the sponsor. This helps you avoid a situation where a sponsor could say, hey, no, we agreed to pay for document shipping and destruction, but not drug destruction. So number one, this language clarifies that all study materials are covered by the sponsor, not just some. Another reason why I really like this language is the in accordance with the budget and payment terms clarification, which will help avoid any potential conflict or inconsistency with the budget and the budget negotiations going on concurrently. It clarifies that yes, the sponsor is paying, but how much and at what frequency is the sponsor paying? Look at the budget and the payment terms, and that should give you the answer. This is really a solid example of a way to beef up your contract language to promote consistency and clarity, and should help reduce missed or disputed payments. I'll quickly show you another good example here. Again, we are referencing the budget and payment terms. We're not only saying that the sponsor is paying for record retention, but we're indicating that there's a specific amount that the sponsor will be paying for this site obligation, and that those specifics can be found in the budget and payment terms. And then one more example added to our earlier monitoring language. See again that we are referencing the budget and payment terms. We're not limiting the language or defining any payment timelines. We're simply stating that the sponsor is going to be paying for their monitoring activities, and the specifics on those payments can be found in the budget and payment terms. If you find this language in red already included in the sponsor template, that's your cue to go ahead and add a fee to cover your costs in the budget. If the contract template does not include this language, you're going to want to add it to the template and add a corresponding fee to the budget, providing justification for the time and effort associated with assisting the sponsor during these monitoring visits. Again, we don't reference specific dollar amounts or payment timelines. We just want to clarify that the site that the site obligation is going to trigger a corresponding sponsor payment. And that payment is described further in the budget payment terms. Now let's touch on the second half of the original list I had up there. So far we've addressed payment and compensation through the specific payment and compensation section. We've discussed the common contract requirements and obligations you will typically have as a site for pretty much every study you take part in. And here at the bottom, we have some more potential hidden costs to you as a site that aren't typical everyday study obligations, but rather there are some potential costs that could arise if something like a claim is brought about under the indemnification section, or if the study is terminated early due to some unforeseen circumstances, or if the sponsor develops a new technology as a result of your participation in the study. These occurrences are definitely few and far between, but the potential costs associated with them should not go overlooked when reviewing a contract. What separates this bottom half from the top half of our list is that you won't usually see these bottom topics addressed in the budget at all, which brings me to a friendly reminder that not all sponsor payment obligations have to be included in the budget. Take subject injury expenses, for example. The parties understand and agree that if a subject is injured as a result of the sponsor's investigational drug or device, the sponsor will be compensating the institution for the costs associated with that treatment. This won't be laid out anywhere in the budget, but that doesn't mean the sponsors aren't required to pay the site. The same can be said for these next three contract provisions. So here's an example of some language that you will find in the IP section of a clinical trial agreement. Note the language in the first two lines of the paragraph here. The sponsor is asking you, the site, to execute such documents and take such other actions as the sponsor deems necessary in order for the sponsor to secure its ownership rights in these study inventions. What should really stick out here is how vague this language is and the sponsor's ability to dictate your obligations. You have a sponsor requiring you to execute documents and take all other actions that the sponsor deems necessary for the sponsor to secure their ownership in inventions. Because inventions aren't typical or necessarily anticipated or expected during the normal conduct of a clinical trial, you're never going to get a sponsor to add this to a clinical trial budget, even as an invoiceable item. What you can do, however, is add some language to the contract to ensure whenever actions you take in order to assist the sponsor in these endeavors will be paid for by the sponsor. So take a look down here at the bottom example. Notice the small addition in red, and although seemingly inconsequential, this ensures that you are protected in the event that the sponsor requires assistance filing their patents. The vague language in the sponsor template, it's important to make sure that if they want your assistance doing something, whether it's 1 hour of the PI's time or a few days, that you are getting compensated for your personnel's efforts. Oddly enough, I don't really see sponsors fight this, and some will even include it in their original templates. The potential IP ramifications are so important to most sponsors that they'll usually agree to pay you and your team for any efforts that help them secure their rights to their intellectual property. So hopefully not too many issues negotiating this one. Here we have another example. This time we're headed toward the indemnification section of your clinical trial agreement. Now, hopefully we never have a claim arise. Everyone performs their obligations properly, and all of our patients get better and avoid any complications. But if there is a claim for which the sponsors agreed to indemnify and or defend the site, they may require a substantial amount of assistance in that defense and the preparation that goes into defending and investigating that claim. Again, note the vague, undefined nature of the site's obligations here in subsection C. The sponsor is requiring the site to assist in the investigation, preparation, and defense of a claim that they are handling. What does that mean exactly for you and your site? We have no idea. This could mean anything from providing the sponsor a few documents to being present for hours, days, or weeks worth of investigations or inquiries, which could occur at any number of locations depending on where the proceedings are taking place. Here again, a seemingly small edit can go a long way to ensure that you are being compensated for the time and effort your staff devotes to these activities. While each party would ideally like to avoid any claims, you cannot count them out. And it's important to recognize the potential time and effort associated with this obligation and to address it properly with some protective language. I've never seen claim assistance fees included in a clinical trial budget, and this is something that will never be discussed in the protocol. So again, we see the importance of reviewing the contract to ensure all of your potential expenses of the site are being covered. If the sponsor's drug or device ends up hurting a study subject, you don't want to be on the hook for hours of your staff's time and effort if the sponsor is going to require your assistance in the defense of that claim. Make sure you are reading the contract closely and make sure you are getting paid. I do occasionally see sponsors push back on this language and argue that they do not pay for this type of assistance, and you can usually get them to back down by explaining the vague nature of the language and asking them to kind of narrow that down or define their interpretation of the assistance that your staff would be required to provide. Let them know that you can't agree to devote undefined and unlimited amounts of time and effort to assist the sponsor with a claim that the sponsor most likely caused. If you ask them to adjust the language to clarify exactly how much and what types of assistance they may need, sponsors typically won't want to restrict their ability to properly defend these claims, and they won't want to reduce their investigation resources. So usually that request gets them to back down and agree to some type of compensation language, like the red text above. And finally, I want to bring your attention to one last section where you'll typically encounter some type of payment language, and that is the termination section. Usually you'll have a section that clarifies that in the event of early termination, the sponsor is still going to pay for the costs you've incurred up to the point of termination. What they won't usually include are the costs associated with that early termination, like subject withdrawal from the study or any potential time and effort associated with the transfer of study subjects to another site. Again, these costs typically won't be included in the budget, but adding some language like the text in red here can help cover you in all cases of early termination for the costs that you might incur with the study wind down. So I hope my portion of the presentation was helpful in highlighting the contract's importance in relation to the sponsor's payment obligations, and hopefully I showed you some ways to beef up your language and effectively account for all of the potential costs you could incur as a research site. I think the big takeaway here is that not everything you'll need to do for a study is covered in the protocol schedule events. You really want to make sure that you're reviewing the contract in accordance with the budget and the protocol for potential conflicts, inconsistencies, and omissions. The contract can quite often be a strong tool in budget negotiations and serve as a way to promote helpful dialogue regarding sponsor payment obligations. And with that, I believe we have some time to take some questions.